She abandoned by family while husband was on a business tour. Brave woman fights through heartbreak to welcome triplets alone. A story of strength and resilience. Welcome, dearest souls. New to our circle of light? Share your radiant name below. We're thrilled to embrace you. To our treasured returning souls, you are the soul of our mission, and we honor your presence deeply. Join us to stay connected on this uplifting journey of love, peace, and renewal. Each story we bring is a blessing crafted with you in mind. Now breathe in deeply, feel the warmth of love, and let your heart's journey unfold. The summer of 1950 painted Hill Country Village in shades of gold and green, but nothing shone brighter than the Morrison Castle perched atop Winchester Hill. Its limestone walls rose like a medieval dream against the Texas sky, complete with sweeping turrets and intricate Gothic windows that caught the sunlight like diamonds. The castle wasn't just a home, it was a statement, a declaration of the Morrison family's iron grip on the region's agricultural empire. James Morrison stood at his bedroom window, watching workers move like ants across the family's vast estate. At 32, he cut an impressive figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that refused to stay combed back and eyes the color of aged whiskey. Unlike his family members, who took pride in barking orders from the comfort of their verandas, James preferred walking among the workers, learning their stories, understanding their struggles. The Morrison family breakfast that morning unfolded like a carefully choreographed play in the grand dining room. Crystal chandeliers threw rainbow patterns across the white tablecloth while servants moved silently, filling coffee cups and replacing empty plates. Robert Morrison, James's father, sat at the head of the table like a king holding court. His once black hair had turned steel grey, but his steel blue eyes retained the sharp calculation that had built their fortune. "The Chapman deal needs to be closed by week's end," Robert announced, cutting into his eggs Benedict. "Their cotton fields will complete our hold on the eastern sector." Catherine Morrison, James's mother, dabbed her lips with a monogram napkin. Her perfectly coiffed silver hair and strand of heirloom pearls represented old money and older prejudices. "I heard they're considering selling to the Hendersons instead," she said, her voice carrying the refined accent she'd cultivated at finishing school. James's siblings completed the picture of apparent perfection. Madison, the eldest sister at 35, had already married into the prestigious Clark family. Her perfectly manicured hands never missed an opportunity to flash her massive diamond ring. Ashley, 30, and Brooklyn, 28, remained unmarried, but not for lack of suitors. Their standards, like their father's, reached astronomical heights. Michael, the youngest at 26, had recently graduated from Harvard Business School and carried himself with the insufferable air of someone who believed education made him superior to everyone else. "The Hendersons," Robert scoffed, his face darkening. "They've been hiring colored workers at their North factory, cutting costs at the expense of quality, no doubt." James's grip tightened on his fork. "Their productivity numbers tell a different story, Father. They've increased output by 30% this quarter." The silence that followed could have frozen hell itself. Catherine's coffee cup clinked against its saucer with deliberate slowness. "Numbers can lie, son," Robert finally said, his voice dangerously soft. "Some things are about more than mere productivity. It's about maintaining standards, preserving our way of life." Madison jumped in, ever the peacekeeper. "James, darling, you really must come to dinner at the country club this weekend. Elizabeth Worthington is visiting from Virginia, and she's just divorced that horrible banker husband of hers." James suppressed a sigh. At 32, his unmarried status had become an increasingly sore point for the family. The parade of socially acceptable potential wives seemed endless, each one more vapid than the last. "I have to oversee the new irrigation system installation," he replied, knowing it was a weak excuse. "Always working," Brooklyn teased, but her eyes held a sharp edge. "One might think you're avoiding your social obligations on purpose." The morning sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows cast colored shadows across the breakfast table, creating an almost ecclesiastical atmosphere. The Morrison family wore their privilege like armor, their prejudices like badges of honor. They'd built their empire on the backs of others while maintaining a careful distance from those they considered beneath them. Later that morning, James walked the grounds with Thomas, their head groundskeeper, who'd served the family for over 40 years. The old man's weathered face held the wisdom of someone who'd seen generations of Morrison pride and folly. "Your grandfather built this castle in 1902, Thomas said, pausing to lean on his rake. "Brought craftsmen from Europe, spent a fortune on every detail. But you know what he told me once? He said, 'Thomas, a man can build his house as high as heaven, but it's the foundation that determines if it'll stand or fall.'" James pondered these words as he surveyed the estate. The castle boasted 48 rooms, including a ballroom with floor-to-ceiling mirrors, a library housing over 10,000 volumes, and a conservatory where his mother grew prize-winning orchids. The grounds stretched for acres, featuring manicured gardens, a private lake, and even a small chapel where generations of Morrisons had been baptized and married. But lately, the grandeur felt hollow. James had traveled extensively for their agricultural business, seen different ways of life, met people who measured wealth not in acres or bank accounts, but in the strength of their communities and the content of their characters. The isolation of the castle, once a point of pride, now felt like a self-imposed prison. The afternoon found him in his father's study, reviewing contracts for their latest acquisition. The room smelled of leather and pipe tobacco, its walls lined with hunting trophies and oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors. Robert Morrison's business philosophy hung framed behind his massive mahogany desk. Control the land, control the people, control the future. "You've been distracted lately," Robert observed, lighting his pipe. "Your mother worries about you." "I've been thinking about modernizing our operations," James replied carefully. "Mechanization, new farming techniques, and hiring practices." Robert interrupted, his eyes sharp. "Don't think I haven't noticed your interest in the Hendersons' methods." James met his father's gaze steadily. "The world is changing, Father. We can either change with it or be left behind." "The world may change," Robert said, blowing out a cloud of smoke, "but principles shouldn't. Your grandfather didn't build this castle so his grandson could tear down everything it stands for." As evening approached, James watched from his balcony as workers headed home for the day. The setting sun painted the castle walls blood red, and for a moment he could almost see the weight of generations of prejudice and pride seeping from the very stones. The Morrison name opened every door in Hill Country Village, but it also came with golden chains that grew heavier by the day. Little did he know that fate was about to throw open a door he never expected, one that would challenge everything his family stood for and force him to choose between the weight of tradition and the lightness of love. But for now, he stood alone in the gathering dusk, the castle's shadow stretching long across the manicured lawn like the hand of the past reaching for the future. A modest beginning. The eastern edge of Hill Country Village was a different world entirely from the Morrison castle. Here, unpaved roads kicked up dust in the summer and turned to mud in the rain. Among the modest wooden houses that lined Cedar Street, the Richard family's home slouched like a tired old man, its weather-beaten clapboards and sagging porch telling stories of hardship that words never could. 18-year-old Deborah Richards' day began long before the sun crept over the horizon. She moved quietly through the dim house, her bare feet knowing exactly which floorboards would creak and betray her movement. The first stop was her mother's room, where Mary Richard lay consumed by consumption, her breathing shallow and raspy in the pre-dawn darkness. "Mama," Deborah whispered, setting down a cup of herbal tea on the bedside table. The scent of chamomile and honey filled the small room, competing with the sharp, medicinal smell that had become a constant presence. Mary's eyes fluttered open, dark circles beneath them, testament to another sleepless night. "My sweet girl," she managed between coughs. "You should be sleeping still." "Got too much to do for sleep," Deborah replied, helping her mother sit up. Her heart clenched at how light her mother felt, how the illness had whittled away at what was once a strong, vibrant woman. Mary Richard had once been the best cook in their part of town, famous for her sweet potato pies and Sunday suppers that drew folks from 3 streets over. Now she could barely keep down broth. The sound of breaking glass from downstairs made both women freeze. Heavy footsteps stumbled through the kitchen, accompanied by muttered curses. "Your father's home early," Mary whispered, worry creasing her forehead. "Go on now, baby, don't let him see you." But Deborah stood her ground. At 18, she'd grown into a young woman of uncommon beauty and even more uncommon strength. Her deep brown eyes held wisdom beyond her years, and her hands, though young, were already marked with the calluses of someone who knew hard work intimately. "William Richard," she called out, descending the stairs, "that better not be Mama's good dishes you're breaking down there." Her father looked up, swaying slightly. His work clothes were stained with dirt and cheap whiskey, and his eyes were bloodshot. Once he'd been a proud man, a skilled carpenter whose hands could coax beauty from raw wood. But when the white-owned construction companies started refusing to hire colored workers, claiming liability concerns, the rejection had broken something in him that whiskey couldn't fix. "Don't you take that tone with me, girl," he slurred, pointing an unsteady finger. "I'm still the man of this house." "Then be a man," Deborah replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Be the father I remember, the one who taught me how to build a bookshelf and told me I could be anything I wanted." For a moment, something flickered in William's eyes. Shame, perhaps, or a ghost of the man he used to be. Then it was gone, drowned in another wave of alcohol-induced anger. He lurched forward, but Deborah had years of practice dodging his drunken movements. She slipped past him, quickly gathering the broken pieces of what had once been her grandmother's serving bowl. "The bank's taking the Henderson place," William mumbled, sinking into a kitchen chair. "Gonna be more families out on the street. Ain't no justice in this world, girl. Sooner you learn that, better off you'll be." But Deborah had stopped listening to such defeatist talk long ago. While she swept up the broken glass, her mind was already running calculations. She'd been saving every penny she could from washing clothes, cooking for her neighbors, and even tutoring some of the younger children in reading. The old storefront on Maple Street was still for rent. She'd checked yesterday. Mr. Peterson, the owner, was one of the few white businessmen in town who'd rent to colored folks, provided they could pay on time. The next morning, after making sure her mother was comfortable and her father had finally fallen into a whiskey-soaked sleep, Deborah walked the 3 miles to the better part of town. Her mother's recipes were secure in her mind, and her own innovations had been tested on appreciative neighbors. The dream of opening her own restaurant had sustained her through countless nights of scrubbing other people's floors and washing their laundry. The bell above Mr. Peterson's office door chimed as she entered. The elderly man looked up from his newspaper, his wire-rimmed glasses slipping down his nose. "Miss Richard," he said, neither friendly nor unfriendly. "What brings you here?" Deborah stood straight, channeling every ounce of dignity her mother had taught her. "The storefront on Maple, sir. I'd like to rent it." He studied her for a long moment. "That's a business property, girl. Rent's $30 a month, due on the 1st. No grace period." "I have $90 saved," she replied, her voice steady. "First and last month's rent, plus security deposit." Mr. Peterson's eyebrows rose slightly. He knew what most coloured folks earned, or rather, what they were allowed to earn. That kind of money represented months, if not years, of careful saving. "And what business you planning to run?" "A restaurant, sir. Home cooking, fresh pies, the kind of food that makes people feel good all the way down to their souls." Something in her words, or perhaps her determination, seemed to reach him. He removed his glasses, cleaning them thoughtfully with his handkerchief. "Your daddy's William Richard, ain't he? Used to do fine carpentry work." "Yes, sir." "Shame what happened to him." He put his glasses back on. "Tell you what, you keep the place clean, pay your rent on time, and don't give me any trouble. We won't have any problems. But first sign of issues, you're out. Understood?" Deborah's heart soared, but she kept her face composed. "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." The storefront was small, barely larger than their home's kitchen, with a cracked linoleum floor and walls that hadn't seen paint in decades. But to Deborah, it was beautiful. The large front window would let in plenty of natural light, and the small kitchen in back had a decent stove and enough counter space to work with. Every spare moment between her regular jobs was spent cleaning, painting, and preparing. Her mother's face lit up when Deborah shared her news. "Oh, baby," Mary whispered, tears in her eyes. "Your grandmama would be so proud. She always said our family's strength was in our cooking. I'm naming it Deborah's Home Kitchen," she told her mother, clutching her thin hands. "And when you're feeling better, you'll help me make your famous sweet potato pie." Mary's smile was tinged with sadness, as though she knew she wouldn't live to see that day. But she squeezed her daughter's hands and began sharing all the secret family recipes she'd never written down, passing on a legacy of love expressed through food. The night before the restaurant's opening, Deborah stood in the freshly painted space, her heart full of equal parts terror and hope. The walls were now a warm butter yellow, the tables rescued from various yard sales and lovingly restored. She'd sewn the curtains herself from feed sacks, and her father, in a rare moment of sobriety, had built her a counter with 3 stools. "Lord," she prayed softly, her voice barely a whisper in the empty restaurant, "I ain't asking for much. Just give me a chance to make something of myself. Let me take care of Mama, and maybe, just maybe, help Daddy find his way back to who he used to be." She didn't know it then, but that little restaurant was about to become more than just a business. It would become a bridge between 2 worlds, the humble setting for a love story that would challenge the very foundations of Hill Country Village's social order. But for now, Deborah Richard stood alone in her dream, her heart full of hope, and her mind filled with recipes passed down through generations of strong women who'd found ways to serve love on a plate. The fateful encounter. October painted Hill Country Village in shades of amber and russet, the evening air carrying the first hints of autumn's bite. Deborah's Home Kitchen had been open for 3 weeks, and though business was modest, every day brought a few more customers drawn by word-of-mouth praise of her cooking. The little restaurant had already developed its own rhythm. Busy during lunch, when workers from nearby businesses sought hot, filling meals at fair prices. Quieter in the evenings when she prepared tomorrow's pies and did her books. That particular Thursday evening, clouds gathered ominously overhead as Deborah stood at her stove, stirring a pot of her grandmother's famous gumbo. The recipe had been passed down through generations, a carefully guarded secret of spices and timing that made the dish something special. Steam rose from the pot, carrying with it aromas of andouille sausage, fresh shrimp, and Holy Trinity, onions, celery, and bell peppers sautéed to perfection. The radio on her counter played softly, Nat King Cole's velvety voice singing Mona Lisa as she worked. She'd saved for weeks to buy that radio, knowing music would make the lonely evening hours more bearable. Outside, the first fat droplets of rain began to fall, drumming against the restaurant's front window in an increasingly urgent rhythm. Lost in thought, Deborah barely registered the sound of a car engine sputtering and dying somewhere nearby. Her mind was occupied with calculations: today's earnings, tomorrow's supplies, her mother's mounting medical bills. Dr. Thompson had been kind enough to offer a payment plan, but the worried look in his eyes during his last visit suggested her mother's condition was worsening. A brilliant flash of lightning illuminated the street outside, followed almost immediately by a thunderclap that rattled the window panes. Deborah jumped, nearly dropping her wooden spoon. That's when she heard it, the distinct sound of dress shoes on her front step, followed by a tentative knock. She hesitated. It was past closing time, and being alone after dark with unfamiliar customers wasn't wise for a young colored woman in 1950s Texas. But another flash of lightning revealed a tall figure through the window's rain-streaked glass, and something in his posture, the way he held himself against the storm, made her reach for the door. The man who stepped inside was like no one who'd ever entered her restaurant before. His expensive suit, though slightly damp, spoke of old money, and his bearing carried the unmistakable air of someone accustomed to moving through the world with ease. Yet there was something else about him, a kindness in his eyes that seemed at odds with his obvious wealth. "I apologize for the intrusion," he said, removing his hat. Water dripped from its brim onto her freshly mopped floor. "My car seems to have given up the ghost just down the street. I saw your light and—" He trailed off, his eyes widening slightly as he took in the aroma filling the restaurant. "Something smells absolutely incredible." Deborah stood frozen for a moment, her mind racing through all the possible consequences of having a white man, clearly a wealthy one, in her restaurant after hours. But her mother's voice echoed in her memory. "Kindness costs nothing, baby, and sometimes it's all we have to give." "That would be the gumbo," she found herself saying. "It's just about ready, if you'd like to wait out the storm with a bowl." He smiled then, a genuine smile that transformed his whole face. "I'm James," he said, deliberately leaving off his last name, "and I would love nothing more." "Deborah," she replied, surprising herself by returning his smile. "Have a seat wherever you'd like." She watched from the corner of her eye as he chose a table, not the counter where most solo diners sat, but a small table near the window where he could watch the storm. His movements were graceful despite his height, and there was something almost contemplative in the way he observed his surroundings. The yellow-painted walls glowed warmly in the lamplight as Deborah moved to the kitchen, her hands steady despite her racing heart as she ladled the gumbo into her best bowl. She added a generous portion of rice and, after a moment's hesitation, placed one of her fresh-baked cornbread muffins on the side. When she brought the food to his table, she noticed his hands, not soft like most wealthy men's, but marked with subtle calluses that spoke of actual work. He thanked her with a graciousness that felt genuine rather than condescending. "Would you mind," he asked, gesturing to the empty chair across from him, "joining me? Unless you have other customers expected." The proper answer would have been no. Every lesson she'd learned about survival in their segregated world screamed against it, but something in his voice, in the way he'd asked, as if her company would be a genuine pleasure rather than a concession, made her pause. "I should check on my pies in the oven," she said carefully. "But perhaps after." His face lit up. "There are pies, too." This evening keeps getting better. As she turned back to her kitchen, she heard his first spoonful of gumbo, and the appreciative sound that followed made her smile despite herself. By the time she returned from checking her sweet potato pies, he'd finished half the bowl. "This," he declared, "might be the best thing I've ever eaten." and I've eaten in restaurants from New York to Paris." "My grandmother's recipe," Deborah said, finally taking the seat across from him. "She always said good cooking is part ingredients, part technique, and part love. She sounds like a wise woman." He broke the cornbread muffin in half, steam rising from its golden interior. "Did she teach you to cook?" "Her and my mama both. Been cooking since I could reach the stove standing on a chair." The words came easily, surprisingly so. There was something about him that made conversation feel natural, as if the weight of social conventions had been temporarily lifted by the storm raging outside. They talked, as he finished his meal, about food first, safe territory, but somehow the conversation meandered to books. He was surprised and delighted to learn she was an avid reader. To music, they shared a love of jazz. To dreams, she spoke of expanding the restaurant, he of modernizing farming practices. Time seemed to flow differently in that lamp-lit room, with rain drumming against the windows and Nat King Cole still crooning softly in the background. Neither mentioned the obvious boundaries they were crossing, the social lines being blurred by their simple act of sharing a meal and conversation. When he finally glanced at his watch, genuine regret crossed his face. "I should call for a tow truck," he said, reaching for his wallet. "Telephone's by the kitchen," she offered, standing quickly. "I'll wrap up a slice of sweet potato pie for you to take along." He reached for her hand, as she started to turn away, then seemed to think better of it. "Thank you," he said instead, his voice soft. "Not just for the meal, but for this, for treating me like a person, not a position." The irony of his words, that he was thanking her for treating him like a person when that was all she'd ever wanted for herself, wasn't lost on either of them. When he finally left, pie carefully wrapped and tucked under his arm, the storm had settled into a gentle rain. He turned at the door, hesitating as if there was more he wanted to say. But in the end, he simply smiled and promised, "I'll be back tomorrow. Save me some of that gumbo." Deborah stood at her window long after his tall figure had disappeared into the rainy darkness, watching the puddles reflect the street lamp's glow. Something had shifted in her world that evening, though she couldn't yet name it. What she did know was that her little restaurant, meant to be simply a means of survival, had somehow become the setting for something both wonderful and dangerous. As she cleaned up for the night, she found herself humming along with the radio, her heart lighter than it had been in years. She didn't know it then, but that rainy evening was just the beginning of a story that would change not only her life, but the very fabric of Hill Country Village itself. A taste of love. James Morrison's second visit to Deborah's home kitchen came not in his gleaming Cadillac, but in a modest Ford sedan, the color of faded coffee. The choice spoke volumes to Deborah. Here was a man accustomed to commanding attention, now trying to slip through the world unnoticed. He arrived just as she was placing fresh cornbread in the window to cool, the autumn sunlight turning the golden crust to amber. "I couldn't stay away," he admitted, standing in the doorway with an almost boyish uncertainty. "I've been thinking about your gumbo all night." "Just the gumbo?" Deborah asked, before she could stop herself, surprising them both with her boldness. A blush crept up her neck as James's smile widened. "The company wasn't bad either," he replied softly. That visit became 2, then 10, then too many to count. James developed an uncanny ability to arrive during the quiet hours, as if he'd memorized the rhythm of her business. Some days he'd appear during the lull between lunch and dinner, briefcase in hand, claiming he needed a quiet place to review contracts. Other times he'd come just before closing, when the evening light painted the restaurant's walls in watercolor shades of pink and gold. Their dance was careful at first. He at his table by the window, she behind her counter, but gradually, inevitably, the distance between them began to shrink. It started with simple things. Deborah lingering to explain a recipe, James offering to help carry supplies from her storeroom. One memorable evening, as rain drummed against the windows, James noticed her rubbing her wrist after hours of kneading dough. "Let me," he said, rising from his seat. Before she could protest, his fingers were gently massaging her aching muscles. The touch sent electricity through her entire body, and for a moment the whole world narrowed to the point where his skin met hers. "My mother used to get the same ache," he explained, his voice rough, "from her gardening." "And did you help her like this?" Deborah managed to ask, trying to keep her tone light despite her thundering heart. "No," he answered simply, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "This is different." Their education of each other was mutual and constant. James brought books, poetry by Langston Hughes and Paul Laurence Dunbar, novels by Zora Neale Hurston and Richard Wright. Deborah taught him about soul food, explaining how her ancestors had taken scraps and leftovers and transformed them into dishes that could feed both body and spirit. "Food is memory," she told him one evening as she demonstrated how to make proper collard greens. "Every recipe has a story." James stood close behind her, watching as she added smoked turkey neck to the pot. "What's this story?" "My great-grandmother was a slave cook in Virginia," she said quietly. "She wasn't allowed to read or write, so she preserved our family history and recipes. Each dish was a letter she could pass down through generations." James's hand found hers on the wooden spoon, and together they stirred the simmering pot. The intimacy of the moment nearly overwhelmed her, this simple act of cooking together bridging centuries of division. Their shared meals became a ritual, each one peeling away another layer of societal constraints. James insisted on trying everything on her menu, not just the popular dishes, wanting to understand the story behind each recipe. Deborah found herself creating new dishes just for him, experimenting with combinations that reflected their growing connection. Traditional southern ingredients with French techniques he'd described from his travels, soul food elevated but never losing its heart. The danger of discovery was ever present, adding both tension and sweetness to their time together. They developed a system of subtle signals. A certain arrangement of pies in the window meant it wasn't safe to come in. A particular song on the radio warning when someone suspicious was nearby. One afternoon, James arrived looking troubled, his usual warm smile replaced by a tightness around his eyes. "What's wrong?" Deborah asked, automatically reaching for the coffee pot. "Had dinner with my family last night," he said, accepting the cup with a grateful nod. They're trying to arrange a marriage for me, with Elizabeth Worthington." The coffee pot nearly slipped from Deborah's hands. "Oh," she managed, turning away to hide her expression. "She comes from a good family, I hear." "Deborah." His voice was barely a whisper, but it drew her eyes back to his. "You know that's not what I want." "What we want isn't always possible," she replied, echoing words her mother had told her countless times. "Why not?" He stood suddenly, pushing back his chair. "Why should we let their prejudices dictate our lives? Their narrow-mindedness define our boundaries?" "Because their prejudices can get me killed," Deborah snapped, her voice sharper than she'd intended. "Because their boundaries aren't just social niceties, they're laws, real laws with real consequences." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken truths. James moved closer, close enough that Deborah could smell his cologne, something expensive and subtle that made her think of forest paths and hidden streams. "I would never let anything happen to you," he said softly. "Some things are beyond even your control, James Morrison." He flinched at the use of his full name. She rarely acknowledged out loud who he really was, heir to one of the most powerful families in Texas. "Then we'll be careful," he insisted. "We'll find a way." And they did try to be careful, but love has a way of making itself known despite all attempts at concealment. It showed in the way James's eyes followed Deborah's movements around the restaurant, in the way she could sense his presence before he even opened the door. It was there in their conversations that grew deeper and more personal, in the books they shared and discussed, in the meals they planned and enjoyed together. One evening, as November painted the sky in deep purples and blues, James arrived later than usual. Deborah had already closed up, but she recognized his knock and let him in. He was carrying a record player, a portable one she'd admired in a shop window downtown. "I thought," he said, setting it up on the counter, "that maybe we could dance." The opening notes of Nat King Cole's Unforgettable filled the small restaurant. James held out his hand, and Deborah took it, allowing him to draw her close. They swayed together in the dim light, their movements creating shadows that danced across the walls, like memories of all the couples who had never been allowed to dance together. "I love you," James whispered into her hair. "I know I shouldn't say it, but God help me, I do." Deborah closed her eyes, letting the music and the moment wash over her. "Loving me is dangerous," she murmured against his chest. "Then let me be in danger." His arms tightened around her. "Let me choose this one true thing in a world full of lies and pretense." They danced until the record ended, holding each other in the darkness of the restaurant that had become their sanctuary. Outside, Hill Country Village continued its rigid adherence to the old ways, but inside these walls they had created their own world, one where love transcended color lines and social barriers, where a touch could bridge generations of division, where two hearts could beat as one despite every force trying to keep them apart. As James finally prepared to leave that night, he paused at the door. "I want to take you somewhere," he said. "Somewhere you can be yourself, where we can be ourselves without hiding." "Where could that possibly be?" Deborah asked, though her heart leaped at the possibility. "Trust me," he smiled, the same smile that had first captured her heart on that rainy evening that now seemed a lifetime ago. "I have an idea." Neither of them could have known then how that idea would change their lives forever, setting in motion events that would shake the very foundations of Hill Country Village's carefully ordered world. But in that moment, standing in the warm light of their shared sanctuary, the future seemed full of possibility rather than danger, and love felt stronger than any barrier society could erect. Chapter 5. Daily Visits. As the golden hues of autumn began to settle over Hill Country Village, James Morrison's visits to Deborah's home kitchen grew more frequent. What had begun as an occasional stop to escape the unrelenting weight of his family's expectations became an essential part of his daily routine. He appeared every day without fail, sometimes alone, sometimes with his entire farm staff in tow. And with each visit, the once quiet, modest restaurant blossomed into a vibrant, beloved spot in the community. Word of Deborah's cooking spread quickly, and her humble establishment became a symbol of both culinary excellence and an unspoken rebellion against the entrenched social order. Deborah, though she had seen her fair share of hardship, found herself inexplicably drawn to James. Every visit, every meal he ordered seemed to bring them closer. The more he spoke, the more Deborah realized that his words were not just polite small talk, but deep reflections of the man he was, torn between the love he had for her and the weight of the world he was born into. With each conversation, they moved beyond the boundaries of their different worlds, sharing not only stories, but dreams, both the ones they had and the ones they dared not yet speak aloud. On the surface, life continued as it always had in Hill Country Village. The sun rose and set over the sprawling estates and small homes. People worked and toiled, and the rhythm of daily life played out as it had for generations. But beneath this surface, something was changing. Deborah's home kitchen had become a quiet epicenter of rebellion. an oasis of love and respect in a world that had never known either. The mornings became routine for James. He would arrive just before noon, his Cadillac now replaced by a modest Ford sedan, the vehicle of a man trying to blend in, to make his mark without the oppressive weight of his family's legacy pressing down on him. He'd sit in the corner near the window, reading through papers, or simply watching the world outside, while Deborah worked in the kitchen, and work she did. Deborah's days had become busier than she ever imagined possible, and yet there was joy in the busyness. Each new customer that entered her restaurant brought with them not just their hunger, but a piece of her growing dream. She could feel the pulse of her little business quicken with every visit from James, every compliment, and every shared moment between them. The weight of her mother's passing had begun to lift, and though she still missed her dearly, there was a sense of peace now, knowing that she could provide for herself, her family, and her community. James's daily presence transformed the way she saw herself too. Her initial hesitation, born of both pride and fear, had long since faded, replaced with a burgeoning confidence that came from knowing her worth. Each day with him, every exchange they shared, was a silent confirmation that she was capable of more than merely surviving. She was living and she was thriving, alongside a man who had come to see her not just as a woman of color, but as an equal. Their conversations, once hesitant and polite, began to unfold with an ease that surprised them both. They spoke about their childhoods, the families they had been born into, and the paths they were carving for themselves, but beneath the words, something deeper grew between them. Their glances became more lingering, more meaningful. The unspoken tension of their growing attraction simmered beneath the surface, electric and undeniable. One afternoon, as the last of the lunch crowd drifted out, James stayed behind. His usual order of gumbo had been replaced by an unspoken request for something more, something that felt more personal. As Deborah moved between the kitchen and the dining room, she caught him watching her, his expression softened by something more than admiration. "How's the gumbo today?" she asked, taking the seat opposite him. "It's perfect," he said, his voice low and steady. "But I think what's really perfect is the way you've turned this place into something, well, something more than just a restaurant. It's like you've turned it into your own little kingdom." Deborah smiled, wiping her hands on her apron before leaning back in her chair. "I don't know about that, but I like to think of it as home. A home where people can come together, forget their differences for a while, and just enjoy good food." He watched her, his gaze lingering on her with a warmth that made her heart flutter despite herself. "You're making a difference here, Deborah. Not just with your food, but with everything you do. You've built something that matters." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of unspoken truth. It was a simple compliment, but it carried more meaning than either of them realized. Deborah had not just built a restaurant, she had built a place where love could grow, where two people from different worlds could meet and build something together. As the weeks passed, their bond deepened. James's visits became not just a regular occurrence, but the highlight of Deborah's days. She found herself anticipating his arrival, longing for the conversations they would share, for the way he listened, really listened, to her thoughts, her dreams, her fears. And in return, she offered him something he had long since given up seeking, a sense of understanding, a safe space to be himself without the suffocating pressure of family, wealth, and expectation. And yet, despite the warmth that bloomed between them, there remained the unspoken tension of their worlds. The reality that James was a Morrison, and Deborah was not. It was a truth they could never fully escape, no matter how much they tried to ignore it. It was present in the glances of suspicion from the town's residents, in the awkward silences that would fall when they were seen together. It was a quiet, persistent shadow, hanging over their every interaction. But neither of them could help the way they felt. They were drawn together not by rebellion, but by something more primal, an undeniable connection that transcended the boundaries their society had set. As Deborah's restaurant grew in popularity, so too did her resolve. The world outside may have been changing, but her little corner of hill country village was a sanctuary, a place where love, hope, and community could flourish, free from the prejudices that had plagued it for so long. And every day, as James sat across from her, sharing a meal and a moment, she knew that they were together, creating something more beautiful than either had ever imagined. The rhythm of their days continued, steady and unyielding, as if the universe itself had finally made space for their love. Their bond, once fragile and uncertain, had taken root and begun to grow, stronger with each passing day. It wasn't just about the meals they shared or the time they spent together. It was about the way they had learned to see each other, truly see each other, for who they were. And in the quiet moments, when the restaurant was empty and the last rays of sunlight filtered through the windows, they would exchange glances, long, lingering looks that spoke of promises yet to be fulfilled, of a love that had just begun to bloom in the most unexpected of places. In the silence between them, there was a deep knowing that they were no longer strangers, no longer just two people from different worlds, but partners, partners in life, in love, and in everything that was yet to come. Chapter 6. A bittersweet proposal. The morning was wrapped in a heavy stillness, as if the world itself was mourning with Deborah. The grey skies mirrored her sorrow, casting shadows across the small storefront of Deborah's home kitchen. Inside, the warmth that had always defined the space seemed muted, the vibrant yellow walls dulled by the weight of her grief. It was the morning after her mother, Mary Richard, had passed away. For Deborah, the pain was still raw, an ache that pulsed in her chest with every breath. She sat at a small table in the back corner, clutching her mother's shawl to her chest. The fabric was worn, its once vivid patterns faded by years of love and use, but to Deborah it was a treasure, one of the last pieces of her mother she had left. The air smelled faintly of chamomile, the tea her mother had always sipped before bed. That familiar scent was both a comfort and a dagger, reminding her of all she had lost. Her mind was a whirlpool of memories. Her mother's laughter as they cooked together, her strong hands guiding Deborah through recipes, her soothing voice telling stories on sleepless nights, and, at the end, the weakness that had taken her, the frail body that had once been so full of life. Deborah blinked back tears, determined to hold herself together, even as her world felt like it was crumbling around her. The sound of the door creaking open broke through her thoughts. She didn't look up, already knowing who it was. James Morrison had been visiting her every day for months, and in that time she had come to recognize the rhythm of his movements, the weight of his footsteps. Today, however, his steps were slower, almost hesitant. He paused in the doorway, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on her. "Deborah," he said softly, his voice a balm to her aching heart. She didn't respond at first, her fingers tightening on the shawl. When she finally looked up, her tear-streaked face was a portrait of grief. "James," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "I don't have the strength today." He crossed the room without hesitation, pulling out a chair and sitting beside her. He didn't speak right away, instead reaching for her hand. His touch was warm, steady, grounding. "You don't have to be strong," he said gently. "Not today. Let me be strong for you." Her composure cracked, and the tears she had been holding back spilled over. She leaned into him, her sobs muffled against his shoulder as he wrapped his arms around her. His embrace was solid, unyielding, and for the first time in what felt like days, she allowed herself to let go. "My mother," she began, her words fragmented by her grief. "She was everything to me. I don't know how to go on without her." "You don't have to do this alone," James replied, his voice a soft promise. "I'm here for whatever you need." They stayed like that for a long time, the room silent except for her quiet cries and his whispered reassurances. Gradually, her sobs subsided, replaced by a heavy stillness. She pulled back slightly, her eyes meeting his. "Thank you," she said, her voice hoarse but sincere, "for being here." James hesitated, his gaze searching hers. He had been planning this moment for weeks, rehearsing the words, imagining the perfect setting. None of those imagined scenarios had included this, a day marked by sorrow and loss. But as he looked at her, saw the depth of her strength even in the face of such pain, he realized there would never be a perfect moment. There was only now. "Deborah," he began, his voice steady despite the nervous flutter in his chest. "There's something I've been wanting to say, something I've been carrying with me for a while now." She frowned slightly, confused by the shift in his tone. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. Her breath hitched as he opened it, revealing a delicate gold ring set with a single sapphire. The stone caught the dim light, sparkling with a quiet elegance that seemed to mirror Deborah herself. "I've been waiting for the right time," James said, his voice soft but filled with conviction. "But life doesn't wait for perfect moments, does it? And neither should love." Deborah's lips parted in shock, her gaze fixed on the ring. Tears welled up in her eyes again, but this time they were not born of grief alone. "James," she whispered, her voice trembling. He knelt before her, taking her free hand in his. "Deborah Richard, I love you. I've loved you since the first moment I stepped into this restaurant. You are my light, my strength, and my reason to hope. Will you marry me? Will you let me stand by your side through the joy and the sorrow for all the days of our lives?" For a long moment, she couldn't speak. The world seemed to tilt, her grief mingling with an overwhelming rush of joy and disbelief. She looked at him, this man who had walked into her life and turned it upside down in the best possible way. But then reality crept in, reminding her of all the reasons this couldn't work, her pain, the societal barriers, the weight of expectations. "James," she said finally, her voice breaking, "I don't know if I'm ready for this. I've just lost so much. My heart feels too broken to hold anything else." He nodded, his eyes soft with understanding. "I don't expect you to have all the answers right now. I just need you to know that I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." Her gaze dropped to the ring, her fingers trembling as she touched it. She thought of her mother's voice, the wisdom she had imparted even in her final days. "Love doesn't wait for convenience," Mary had once told her. "It comes when it's ready, and it asks you to be brave enough to accept it." Deborah looked back at James, and in his eyes she saw that bravery. Slowly she nodded, a tentative smile breaking through her tears. "Yes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, James, I'll marry you." Relief and joy lit up his face as he slipped the ring onto her finger. He pulled her into his arms again, holding her as if the world itself could fall apart around them and he would still keep her safe. As they sat there, wrapped in each other's arms, the weight of her grief began to lift, replaced by the quiet strength of their shared love. The day that had begun in sorrow ended in hope. And though they both knew the road ahead would be fraught with challenges, they also knew that together they could face anything. Their bittersweet engagement was not the fairy tale either of them had envisioned, but it was real. It was theirs, and it was perfect in its imperfection. The small ring on Deborah's finger was not just a promise of marriage, it was a promise of partnership, of unwavering support, of love that would endure even the harshest storms. The world outside may have been filled with barriers and prejudices, but within the walls of Deborah's home kitchen they had created a sanctuary, a place where their love could grow, unburdened by the expectations of others. And as they sat together, the shadows of the past began to fade, replaced by the bright, undeniable light of a future they would build together. Chapter 7. The Castle Beckons. The next morning dawned bright and clear, a sharp contrast to the emotional storm that had consumed the previous day. James had promised Deborah a day of distraction, a day to step away from her grief and begin envisioning the future they were now planning together. He had insisted on taking her somewhere special, though he hadn't revealed where. Deborah, still feeling the weight of her emotions, hesitated, but his earnestness won her over. As they drove through Hill Country Village, the scenery began to shift. The modest homes and dirt roads gave way to sprawling estates, manicured gardens, and winding driveways that stretched into the horizon. Deborah had seen this part of town before, but only from a distance. It was a place where people like her rarely ventured, a world defined by privilege and exclusivity. Her heart began to race as the car turned onto a long, tree-lined drive. At the end of the road, looming against the cloudless sky, was the Morrison estate, the castle. Deborah's breath caught in her throat as she took in the sight. The towering spires seemed to pierce the heavens, their edges gilded by the morning sun. The limestone facade glowed with an almost ethereal brilliance, its intricate carvings and sweeping arches rivaling the grandeur of any European palace she had seen in books. The castle was a monument to wealth, power, and the Morrison family's legacy. "James," she whispered, her voice tinged with both awe and trepidation. "This is your home?" James glanced at her, a soft smile playing on his lips. "It's where I grew up," he said, "but it hasn't felt like home for a long time, not until now." The words warmed her, but they also deepened her unease. As the car approached the massive iron gates, Deborah couldn't help but feel out of place. This was a world she had only seen in movies, a world that had never welcomed people like her. Her hands tightened on the shawl she had draped over her lap, a reminder of her mother's strength and the life she had left behind. The gates creaked open, and the car rolled into the sprawling courtyard. Every detail of the estate screamed opulence. Fountains gurgled in the center, their sculptures of mythological creatures glistening with morning dew. Rows of perfectly pruned hedges lined the walkways, and marble statues of stoic ancestors seemed to watch their every move. Deborah felt their silent judgment, as if they knew she didn't belong. James parked the car and turned to her, his expression serious but kind. "Deborah," he said, taking her hands in his, "I know this is overwhelming. I know it's not an easy place to walk into, but I want you to know that none of this matters to me. You're what matters." Her eyes met his, and for a moment the fear subsided. "I trust you, James," she said quietly, "but this is a lot." "I know," he admitted, "but we'll face it together." He helped her out of the car, his hand steadying her as they made their way up the grand stone steps. The massive wooden doors loomed ahead, their brass handles polished to a mirror-like shine. As James pushed them open, Deborah's senses were immediately overwhelmed. The entry hall was cavernous, its vaulted ceiling adorned with frescoes of angels and cherubs. Chandeliers of crystal and gold cast shimmering light across the marble floors, where intricate mosaics depicted scenes of prosperity and conquest. A grand staircase curved gracefully upward, its banisters carved with patterns so delicate they seemed almost lace-like. Deborah took a step inside, her shoes clicking softly against the marble. The air smelled faintly of fresh flowers and aged wood, a blend of refinement and history. Every corner of the room seemed to gleam with wealth and promise, yet shadows lingered in the corners, hinting at the cost of such grandeur. James guided her through the hall, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back. "This way," he said, his voice low. "I want to show you something." They passed through room after room, each more opulent than the last. A library with walls lined by towering bookshelves, their contents so vast they required rolling ladders to access. A ballroom with gilded mirrors that stretched from floor to ceiling, their surfaces reflecting the light in dazzling patterns. A conservatory filled with exotic plants and orchids, their colors vibrant against the glass walls. Deborah's awe was tinged with unease. This was not just wealth, it was a different world entirely. She could feel it in the silence, in the way the staff they passed barely met her gaze. She could feel it in the weight of the history that clung to the walls, a history that had never included someone like her. Finally, James led her to a small sitting room tucked away in a quieter wing of the castle. The space was cozy, almost intimate, with plush armchairs and a fireplace crackling softly. A large bay window overlooked the sprawling gardens, its panes framing the scene like a painting. "This is my favorite room," James said, guiding her to one of the chairs. "It's the one place in the house that feels human, like it was made for living, not for showing off." Deborah sank into the chair, the soft cushions enveloping her. She looked out the window, her gaze drifting over the gardens. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine what it would be like to belong here, to make this castle her home. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. "James," she said, her voice hesitant, "why did you bring me here?" He knelt before her, his hands finding hers once again. "Because I wanted you to see it," he said simply. "This is my past, Deborah, my family's legacy. But it's not my future. You are." Her breath caught, her heart pounding in her chest. The sincerity in his eyes was undeniable, but so was the enormity of what he was asking of her. To step into this world, to face its judgment and its barriers, was no small thing. "I don't know if I can do this," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "This place, your family, it's so far from everything I've ever known." "I know it won't be easy," James said, his voice steady. "But I also know that we're stronger together. I'll fight for you, Deborah. For us, I'll fight until this castle, this legacy, becomes a place that welcomes you, a place that feels like home." Tears filled her eyes as she looked at him. She could see the determination in his face, the depth of his love, and for the first time, she began to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could carve out a place for themselves in this world. She nodded, her fingers tightening around his. "Okay," she said softly. "I'll try." James smiled, his relief evident. He leaned forward, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "That's all I ask," he said. "One step at a time, together." As they sat there, the castle's grandeur seemed to fade into the background. For all its splendor, it was just a house that could be transformed by love, by courage, by the strength of two people who refused to be bound by the past. And in that moment, with the sunlight streaming through the bay window and James's hand in hers, Deborah allowed herself to hope. Chapter 8. A Wedding of Whispers. The day of the wedding dawned bright and clear, as if the heavens themselves had chosen to shine on James and Deborah. Yet the brilliance of the sun couldn't dispel the tension that clung to the air. Their union, born of love and defiance, had sparked whispers that had spread like wildfire across Hill Country Village. For weeks, the town had buzzed with rumors, opinions, and outright scorn. But James and Deborah had remained steadfast, determined to claim their happiness despite the odds. The wedding took place in the grand hall of the Morrison estate, a space designed for opulence, but burdened by an atmosphere of division. The high ceilings were adorned with crystal chandeliers that cast shimmering light over the polished floors, while gilded arches framed every doorway. White roses and lilies filled the room, their delicate fragrance weaving through the air like a hopeful promise. Yet for all its beauty, the hall felt cold and hollow. The guest list was a glaring reflection of the social tensions surrounding the couple. Most of the Morrison family's usual circle, the wealthy landowners, the influential politicians, the elite socialites, had declined to attend. Those who did come sat stiffly, their expressions ranging from polite disinterest to thinly veiled disdain. On one side of the room, Deborah's cousins and church family occupied several rows of chairs. They wore their Sunday best, modest suits and brightly colored dresses. But their joy was tempered by the unease of being in a space where they clearly weren't welcome. Deborah's Aunt Clara, a woman with a spine of steel and a heart of gold, clutched her Bible tightly, her sharp eyes daring anyone to challenge her presence. Beside her, young cousins fidgeted, their whispers of excitement muted by their parents' stern glances. On the other side, a small cluster of James's true friends gathered, men and women who had stood by him despite his family's disapproval. They offered smiles of encouragement, but their presence did little to counterbalance the icy stares from the other guests. The silence in the hall was broken only by the faint hum of conversation, much of it unkind. "Did you see the way they're dressed?" one woman whispered to her companion, her eyes darting toward Deborah's side of the room. "It's like they don't even belong here." "Hardly surprising," the other replied with a smirk. "What else would you expect? This whole thing is a spectacle. Can you imagine what Robert Morrison must be thinking?" Across the room, a man leaned toward his wife, his voice low but audible enough to carry. "I give it 6 months. This marriage will crumble faster than a house of cards." Deborah's cousin Micah, a young man with a fiery temper and a protective streak, overheard the comment. He clenched his fists, his jaw tightening as he prepared to respond, but Aunt Clara placed a calming hand on his arm, her gaze firm. "Not today, Micah," she said quietly. "This is Deborah's day. Don't let them ruin it." At the front of the hall, James stood tall and proud, his joy shining through despite the tension around him. He wore a tailored suit that accentuated his broad shoulders and confident stance, but it was the warmth in his eyes that drew attention. His gaze never left the doorway, where he knew Deborah would soon appear. The murmur of conversation stilled as the music began. A soft, lilting melody played on a grand piano. All heads turned as Deborah stepped into view, her arm linked with Micah's. She was a vision of grace and beauty, her white gown flowing around her like a river of silk. The dress, though simple compared to the extravagance of the setting, carried an elegance that was uniquely hers. A veil framed her face, but it couldn't hide the determination in her eyes or the quiet strength in her posture. As she walked down the aisle, whispers rippled through the crowd like a current. "She looks nervous," one woman murmured. "More like she knows she doesn't belong," another added, a cruel smile tugging at her lips. James's sister Madison, seated near the front, leaned toward her younger sister Brooklyn. "This is a mistake," she hissed. "He's throwing away everything for a woman who doesn't understand our world." Brooklyn, though quieter in her disdain, nodded in agreement. "It's embarrassing." Despite the muttered comments, Deborah kept her head high, her gaze locked on James. Each step felt like a battle, but she drew strength from the love she saw in his eyes. By the time she reached the altar, the whispers had faded into background noise, drowned out by the steady rhythm of her heartbeat. The ceremony began, the officiant's words echoing through the hall. James and Deborah exchanged vows, their voices steady and filled with emotion. For them, the world outside the altar ceased to exist. In that moment, it was just the two of them, bound by a love that refused to be dimmed by prejudice or fear. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, James didn't hesitate. He kissed Deborah with a passion that left no doubt of his commitment, his hands framing her face as if she were the most precious thing in the world. The room erupted into a mix of reactions, polite applause from some, awkward coughs from others, and even a few disapproving mutters. As the couple turned to face their guests, James's hand firmly clasping Deborah's, they were met with a divided room. On one side, Deborah's family and friends cheered, their joy unrestrained. On the other, the applause was sparse, forced, and accompanied by expressions that ranged from discomfort to outright disdain. But Deborah didn't care. She squeezed James's hand, drawing strength from his presence. This was their day, their victory. The reception that followed was no less fraught with tension. The lavish hall was filled with tables adorned with crystal centerpieces and silk tablecloths, but the atmosphere was anything but celebratory. Guests sat in segregated clusters, the divide between the two sides as palpable as a physical barrier. Deborah's Aunt Clara refused to be cowed. She marched up to the buffet table with her head held high, her voice ringing out as she complimented the food. "This roast is delicious," she declared, her tone daring anyone to contradict her. Her boldness drew glares from a group of Morrison family friends, one of whom whispered loudly, "She acts like she owns the place." Deborah overheard the comment but chose to rise above it, focusing instead on James, who stood by her side the entire evening. Together they moved between the tables, thanking guests and ignoring the undercurrent of judgment that followed them. By the end of the night, the whispers had grown quieter, the energy of the room shifting as people began to leave. When the last guest departed, James and Deborah stood alone in the hall, the echoes of the day lingering around them. "You were incredible," James said, pulling her into his arms. Deborah sighed, her head resting against his chest. "I couldn't have done it without you." "You'll never have to," he promised. "From now on, it's you and me, no matter what." In that moment, standing together in the grand but empty hall, they knew their journey was only beginning. Their wedding had been a study in contrasts, joy and pain, love and prejudice, unity and division, but it was also a testament to their resilience. They had chosen each other against all odds, and they would face the future together, hand in hand. Chapter 9. 8 Months of Paradise. The days following their wedding felt like stepping into a new world, a world shaped not by the grandeur of the Morrison estate, but by the love James and Deborah had built. Though the castle loomed large and cold, with its towering spires and sprawling halls, they carved out a space of their own within its walls. Their private wing, once an unused part of the estate, became their sanctuary. Here, away from the prying eyes of family and the murmurs of disapproving guests, their love flourished. Deborah had always had a gift for turning the ordinary into something extraordinary, and their rooms were no exception. The once austere space, with its heavy drapes and somber furniture, slowly transformed under her touch. She replaced the dark, imposing curtains with lighter fabrics that allowed sunlight to stream in, casting golden patterns across the room. Soft cushions, hand-stitched quilts, and vases of fresh flowers brightened the space, turning it into a warm, inviting haven that felt worlds apart from the rest of the castle. James watched in awe as Deborah brought the rooms to life. Her laughter, her joy in the small details, filled the air with an energy that seemed to chase away the shadows of the estate. The sound of her humming, as she rearranged furniture or tended to a bouquet, became the music of his days, a melody he never tired of hearing. "These rooms," Deborah said one afternoon, as she stood back to admire her handiwork, "they're not just ours, they're our story. Every piece of fabric, every flower, every choice. It's us, James. It's who we are together." James smiled, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "And who we are is perfect. he whispered into her ear, pressing a kiss to her temple. Their days were a blend of simplicity and magic. Each morning James would wake before the sun rose, lying still to watch Deborah as she slept, her features relaxed and peaceful. He marveled at the way the early light played across her skin, turning her into a vision of quiet beauty. When she stirred, her eyes slowly opening to meet his, it felt like the beginning of something sacred. "Good morning, Mrs. Morrison," he would say, his voice low and full of love. "Good morning, Mr. Morrison," she'd reply, a soft smile spreading across her face as she snuggled closer. They would share breakfast in their sunlit sitting room, a simple meal of fresh bread, fruit, and coffee. Deborah insisted on preparing it herself, much to the dismay of the castle staff. "I don't need anyone else to make me feel cared for," she told James one morning as she handed him a plate. "I have you for that." In the afternoons, they explored the estate's vast grounds. James introduced Deborah to every corner of the property. The gardens bursting with blooms, the shaded groves where the air smelled of pine and earth, the hidden lake that glimmered like a sapphire under the sun. They walked hand in hand, their laughter echoing through the trees, their conversations flowing effortlessly. "This place," Deborah said one day as they sat on the edge of the lake, their bare feet dipping into the cool water, "it feels like it's ours now, not just yours. Ours." James turned to her, his expression tender. "It is ours, Deborah, every part of it, but it only feels that way because of you." Evenings were their most cherished time. They would retreat to their rooms, lighting the fireplace as the sun dipped below the horizon. Deborah loved to read aloud from the collection of books James had gifted her, a mix of classics and newer works that reflected both their tastes. Her voice, smooth and lyrical, brought the stories to life in a way that made James fall in love with her all over again. "Do you know how extraordinary you are?" he asked her one night as she closed the book, her fingers trailing over the embossed cover. She looked at him, her brow furrowing slightly. "Extraordinary? James, I'm just me." He shook his head, taking her hands in his. "You're not just anything, Deborah. You've turned my world upside down in the best way possible. You've made me see what matters, what doesn't. You've given me hope, love, everything I never thought I could have." Tears glistened in her eyes, and she leaned forward to kiss him. It was a kiss filled with gratitude, with promise, with the depth of a love that defied the odds. Their sanctuary wasn't untouched by the realities of the outside world. James's family remained distant, their cold shoulders and sharp words a constant reminder of the divide they refused to bridge. Deborah knew she was the subject of their scorn, that her presence in the castle was a thorn in their side. But James shielded her from the worst of it, standing firm against their prejudices and ensuring their love remained untouched. "Let them think what they want," James said one evening after another tense encounter with his father. "This is our life, Deborah, not theirs. They don't get to dictate how we love each other." Deborah nodded, her resolve strengthening. "They can't take this away from us," she agreed. "Not this, not ever." For 8 months, they lived in this paradise of their own making. They built routines that felt sacred, rituals that deepened their connection. Deborah would surprise James with little notes tucked into his coat pocket, words of love and encouragement that made his heart swell. James, in turn, brought her flowers from the gardens, each bouquet a symbol of his devotion. They danced together in their sitting room, the fire casting flickering shadows on the walls as they swayed to the music of their own hearts. They shared secrets and dreams, their voices blending into the quiet hum of the night. They laughed, cried, and loved with a fierceness that made every moment feel like a triumph. "You've changed me, Deborah," James told her one night as they lay tangled together under the soft glow of the moonlight. "You've made me better, stronger, more alive. "You've done the same for me," she replied, her fingers tracing the lines of his face. "You've shown me what love can be, what life can be." Their paradise wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. And in those 8 months they proved to themselves and to the world that love, real love, could flourish even in the most unlikely places. Together they turned a cold, imposing castle into a home filled with laughter, warmth, and a love that refused to be dimmed. Chapter 10. A Painful Departure. The morning James announced his trip to Europe began like any other in their sanctuary. Sunlight streamed through the delicate curtains Deborah had chosen, casting a warm glow across their sitting room. She was tidying up the breakfast dishes when James walked in, his expression both excited and hesitant. "I need to talk to you," he began, his voice steady but tinged with something unspoken. Deborah looked up from the sink, drying her hands on a towel. "What's on your mind?" He paused, then pulled a letter from his jacket pocket. The crisp envelope bore the seal of an international agricultural organization. "I've been invited to speak at the European Agricultural Conference. It's a big opportunity, Deborah. They want me to share our work on modernization and sustainable farming." Deborah felt her heart tighten. "How long will you be gone?" 2 months, James said, his gaze fixed on hers, as though bracing for her reaction. "I know it's a long time, but this could open doors for us, connections, innovations that could change everything." Deborah managed a smile, though her chest felt heavy. "It sounds like an incredible opportunity, James. You should go." But as the words left her lips, she felt a pang of regret. She wasn't ready for him to leave. Not now, not when she had so much to tell him. What James didn't know, what she hadn't yet found the courage to say, was that she was carrying their child. The discovery had both thrilled and terrified her. She had imagined countless ways to tell him, each one full of joy and excitement, but with his announcement, the timing no longer felt right. The days of preparation. The week leading up to James's departure was filled with activity. Deborah insisted on helping him pack, though each carefully folded shirt felt like a goodbye. She busied herself with the tasks, her hands trembling slightly as she arranged his belongings in neat rows. "Are you sure you don't mind me leaving?" James asked one evening as they worked side by side. His tone was light, but his eyes searched hers for reassurance. "I want what's best for you," Deborah said softly, her fingers brushing against his scarf as she folded it. "For us." James paused, taking her hand in his. "You know I'll miss you every second, don't you?" Deborah nodded, her smile small but genuine. "And I'll miss you just as much." Yet beneath her composed exterior, a storm of emotions brewed. Every night after James had fallen asleep, Deborah would sit by the fire, her hand resting on her still flat stomach. She longed to share her secret, to let him know about the life growing inside her. But fear held her back. Fear of his reaction, fear of adding to his burden before such an important trip. The morning of departure. The day came too soon. Deborah woke before dawn, her heart heavy with the knowledge that their time together was running out. She prepared breakfast, though neither of them ate much, the weight of their impending separation stealing their appetites. James packed the last of his things, his movements efficient, but tinged with reluctance. Deborah watched him from across the room, memorizing every detail, the way his dark hair fell across his forehead, the way his hands moved with quiet precision. "Promise me you'll take care of yourself," James said as he closed his suitcase. "I will," Deborah replied, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. They walked to the waiting car together, the morning air crisp and filled with the faint scent of dew-covered grass. James took her hands in his expression tender but resolute. 2 months will pass before you know it, he said, his voice full of quiet conviction. "And I'll write to you every day." Deborah nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "I'll write to you too." James pulled her into his arms, holding her as if he could imprint the memory of her onto his very soul. When he kissed her, it was soft and lingering, a promise in the face of their parting. "I love you," he murmured against her hair. "I love you too," she whispered, her voice trembling. As the car pulled away, Deborah stood in the driveway, her arms wrapped around herself. She watched until the car disappeared down the long, tree-lined drive, the ache in her chest growing heavier with every passing moment. Life without James. The castle felt unbearably quiet after James left. Their wing, once filled with laughter and the hum of their shared routines, now echoed with silence. Deborah threw herself into maintaining their sanctuary, finding solace in the familiar tasks. She rearranged flowers, fluffed pillows, and kept the fire burning, as though keeping the space alive would somehow bridge the distance between them. Each day, she waited eagerly for the post. James's letters arrived like clockwork, filled with descriptions of the conference, the people he met, and the places he visited. His words painted vivid pictures of bustling cities, sprawling fields, and innovative ideas. "Everything here is fascinating," he wrote in one letter, "but nothing compares to you. I count the days until I can hold you again." Deborah's replies were equally heartfelt, though she carefully avoided mentioning the baby. She wanted to tell him in person, to see the joy light up his face when he learned the news. Until then, she carried the secret close to her heart, finding strength in the quiet anticipation of their future. Quiet reflections. The nights were the hardest. Deborah often sat by the fire, her hand resting protectively on her stomach. She spoke softly to the baby, her words a mix of hopes and reassurances. "Your father is going to be so happy," she murmured one evening. "He's the most wonderful man I've ever known. And you?" Her voice broke slightly and she placed a hand over her mouth to steady herself. "You're already so loved." She found solace in small moments, watching the sunrise from their window, tending to the flowers James had planted in the garden, rereading his letters until she could recite them from memory. These routines became her anchors, reminders that their love was strong enough to weather the distance. A quiet resolve. As the weeks passed, Deborah's love for James only deepened. The ache of his absence was a constant companion, but it was tempered by the knowledge that their time apart was temporary. She focused on the future, on the life they were building together, and on the tiny heartbeat that made her feel connected to him even when he was thousands of miles away. "I'll tell him when he comes back," she whispered to herself one night, her hand resting protectively over her stomach. "It'll be the first thing I do." And as she closed her eyes, the flickering firelight casting warm shadows across the room, Deborah allowed herself to hope for James's safe return, for their reunion, and for the promise of the family they would soon become. Chapter 11. Betrayal and Exile. The moment James's car disappeared down the long driveway, Deborah felt a chill in the castle's air that had nothing to do with the approaching winter. The grand halls, with their gilded mirrors and echoing steps, became oppressive, their beauty masking the deep hostility growing within. Without James to shield her, the Morrison family's disdain turned from whispers to open contempt. It began with small acts of cruelty, subtle enough to be dismissed if Deborah didn't know better. One morning, as she reached for her tea, a servant's hand slipped, spilling the scalding liquid onto her. "Oh, how clumsy of me," the maid said with mock concern, her lips twitching into a smile as Catherine Morrison looked on from her seat at the head of the table. "Deborah," Catherine drawled, her voice laced with false sweetness, "I do hope you're not upset. Accidents happen." Deborah clenched her jaw, suppressing the retort that hovered on her tongue. It wasn't just the servants, even the family themselves joined in their covert warfare. At meals, Madison and Brooklyn ignored her completely, whispering and laughing amongst themselves as though she weren't there. Her place at the dining table seemed to vanish entirely one evening when she arrived to find the table set for everyone except her. "Did no one call you for dinner?" Catherine asked when Deborah appeared, feigning surprise. "Oh, what a shame. I suppose the kitchen might have some leftovers." The smirk she exchanged with Madison confirmed the slight was deliberate. Deborah tried to hold her ground, telling herself that James would be back soon, that she could endure this for the sake of the life growing within her. But as her pregnancy began to show, the family's malice became harder to ignore. Their glances lingered longer, their whispers grew louder, and their words became more venomous. "I heard she planned this," Madison remarked one afternoon, her voice carrying down the hall where Deborah stood unseen. "A baby, the oldest trick in the book." Catherine's laughter was as cold as the marble beneath Deborah's feet. "Of course she did. A woman like her wouldn't survive here otherwise. Trapping James was the only way." The words struck Deborah like a physical blow. Her hand instinctively went to her belly, as though to shield her unborn child from their scorn. She wanted to confront them, to demand they stop their lies, but she knew better. Alone in this vast, hostile castle, her protests would only fuel their cruelty. As the weeks passed, their tactics grew more vicious. Rumors spread among the servants that Deborah had stolen from the estate, that she wasn't the faithful, devoted wife James believed her to be. When she walked through the halls, the servants' gazes grew colder, their whispers louder. "It's only a matter of time before she's gone," one maid said as Deborah passed, her words sharp and clear. The isolation was suffocating. Even the small sanctuary she and James had created felt tainted by the hostility seeping through the castle walls. She clung to the letters James sent, each word a lifeline reminding her that she wasn't entirely alone. But even those couldn't keep the growing despair at bay. The final betrayal came on a stormy night. Thunder rumbled through the estate as rain lashed against the windows, but the fury outside was nothing compared to what waited for Deborah in the grand hall. Catherine stood at the center of the room, her arms crossed, her expression cold. Madison and Brooklyn flanked her, their faces twisted with smug satisfaction. "You need to leave," Catherine said, her voice devoid of warmth or hesitation. Deborah blinked, her heart pounding. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," Catherine replied, stepping closer. "This is not your home. It never was." Deborah's hands went instinctively to her belly, as though the motion could anchor her in place. "This is James's home too. I'm his wife, the mother of his children. You can't do this." Catherine's lips curled into a cruel smile. "James isn't here, and when he returns, he'll thank me for saving him from this embarrassment." Madison stepped forward, her voice dripping with mock concern. "Honestly, Deborah, it's better this way. You've overstayed your welcome." The servants appeared then, carrying a small bag that contained Deborah's belongings. She felt her breath hitch as they set it at her feet. "You can't do this," she said, her voice breaking. James will thank us," Catherine interrupted sharply. "You've tarnished this family enough, now leave." Deborah looked at the three women, her hands trembling. The weight of their hatred was suffocating, but she refused to let them see her cry. With what little dignity she could muster, she turned toward the door, her heart breaking with each step. The rain greeted her like an old enemy, soaking her clothes within moments. She clutched her bag tightly, her other hand cradling her belly as she walked away from the castle. Her breaths came in shallow gasps, the cold biting into her skin, but she kept moving. For her children, she would endure this. For them, she would find a way. She whispered to the life growing within her, her voice trembling. "I won't let them take this from us. We'll be okay, I promise." The storm raged on as Deborah disappeared into the night, the castle's imposing silhouette fading behind her. Each step away from the Morrison estate felt like leaving behind a part of herself. But as she looked down at her growing belly, a flicker of determination sparked within her. No matter what, She would protect her children. She would find safety even in a world that seemed determined to cast her aside. Chapter 12. Hidden Blessings. The storm had not yet passed when Deborah stumbled along the muddy road, her strength waning with each step. The weight of her unborn children pressed heavily on her, both physically and emotionally. Her body ached, her mind swirled with fear, and her heart was a tangled mess of sorrow and resolve. She had been cast out of the castle without a shred of mercy, but the tiny lives stirring within her gave her purpose. The sound of hooves on wet ground broke through the night. Deborah froze, her hand instinctively going to her belly. Was someone following her to ensure she left for good? But as the cart approached, she saw a familiar figure at the reins, Marcus, the castle's head servant. "Mrs. Morrison!" Marcus called out, his deep voice laced with concern. He brought the cart to a halt and jumped down, his boots splashing in the mud. "Marcus!" Deborah whispered, tears streaming down her face. Relief and exhaustion overwhelmed her as he reached her. "You shouldn't be out here in your condition," he said firmly, his gaze dropping to her swollen belly. "Come with me. Emma and I will take care of you." Deborah hesitated, her pride and fear warring within her, but Marcus's steady presence was impossible to refuse. She nodded weakly, and he guided her into the cart with careful hands. As they rode through the storm, Marcus glanced back at her, his face etched with worry. "You're safe now," he assured her. "We'll figure this out together." The warm glow of Marcus and Emma's cottage was a sharp contrast to the cold, stormy night. Emma was waiting at the door, her hands clasped tightly in front of her as she peered into the darkness. When she saw Marcus helping Deborah down from the cart, she rushed forward, her face filled with concern. "Oh, bless you, child," Emma said, wrapping her arms around Deborah as if she were her own daughter. "Come inside. Let's get you warm." The interior of the cottage was simple but inviting, with a crackling fire, sturdy wooden furniture, and the faint aroma of herbs hanging in the air. Emma guided Deborah to a chair by the hearth, wrapping her in a warm blanket and pressing a steaming cup of tea into her hands. "You're too pale," Emma said, kneeling beside her. "You need rest and proper care. You leave everything to us, all right?" Deborah's voice cracked as she whispered, "Thank you. I don't know where I'd be without you." Emma squeezed her hand. "You're not alone anymore, Deborah. We'll see you through this." In the days that followed, Deborah found solace in the kindness of Marcus and Emma. The couple treated her with a compassion she hadn't felt since James had left. Emma fussed over her, ensuring she ate well and rested, while Marcus made quiet trips to the estate, gathering supplies and keeping tabs on the Morrison family. "They think they've gotten away with it," Marcus said one evening, his voice low and steady. He sat at the kitchen table, spreading out a pile of notes and documents. "But I've been watching, listening. When James comes back, he'll know everything." Deborah looked at him, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Why are you risking so much for me?" she asked softly. Marcus met her gaze, his expression firm. "Because it's the right thing to do, and because James would never forgive me if I didn't." Emma nodded, her hands busy kneading dough at the counter. "You and those babies deserve better than what they've done to you. We won't let them win." The night the triplets arrived was one of both pain and triumph. Deborah woke in the early hours, her body racked with sharp contractions. Panic surged through her as she realized the time had come. "Emma!" she called, her voice trembling. Emma was by her side in an instant, her calm demeanor steadying Deborah's frayed nerves. "It's all right, child," she said, brushing Deborah's damp hair from her face. "We've got this." Marcus fetched water and clean linens as Emma guided Deborah through the labor. Her voice was a constant source of reassurance, her hands gentle yet firm. "Just breathe, Deborah," Emma said, as the first baby entered the world. A strong, healthy boy with a powerful cry. Emma swaddled him carefully and placed him in a makeshift crib. "One down. You're doing beautifully." The second baby, a girl, arrived minutes later. Deborah's exhaustion was evident, but Emma's steady encouragement kept her going. "That's it, sweetheart. One more push." The final baby, another boy, was smaller than his siblings, but just as spirited. His cries filled the room as Emma cleaned and swaddled him, her face glowing with pride. "You've done it, Deborah," Emma said, placing the third baby in her arms. 3 beautiful, healthy babies. Deborah's tears flowed freely as she looked at her children. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I couldn't have done this without you." Emma sat beside her, her expression tender. "It's an honor to be here for you, Deborah. These little ones are a blessing." Marcus stood nearby, his normally stoic face softened by the sight of the newborns. "They're fighters," he said quietly, "just like their mother." The days that followed were filled with a quiet joy. The triplets thrived under the loving care of Deborah, Emma, and Marcus. The cottage, once a simple home, became a sanctuary, a place where love and humanity flourished in the face of adversity. As Deborah rocked one of her babies by the fire, she whispered softly, "You're safe now. And when your father comes back, we'll be a family again. I promise." In Marcus and Emma's home, Deborah found not only safety, but a renewed sense of hope. The kindness they showed her was a reminder that even in the darkest times, humanity and love could prevail. Together, they began to build a future, one small step at a time. Chapter 13. The Truth Unveiled. The Morrison Castle loomed large as James stepped through its towering doors, eager to reunite with Deborah. His trip to Europe had been a whirlwind of meetings, accolades, and success, but none of it mattered compared to seeing her again. Letters had been his only connection to her during the long weeks apart, but she hadn't responded to his last few. The thought unsettled him, but he had attributed it to the strain of her pregnancy. He expected warmth, perhaps even joy, upon his return. Instead, he was met with the cold, calculating stares of his mother, Catherine, and his sisters, Madison and Brooklyn. They stood in the grand foyer as though awaiting a guest they had no interest in entertaining. "Where's Deborah?" James asked, setting down his travel bag. His voice carried the excitement of a man ready to embrace his family. Catherine exchanged a glance with Madison before stepping forward, her face composed but devoid of warmth. "She's gone, James," she said simply. James froze, his heartbeat quickening. "Gone? What do you mean, gone? Where is she?" "She left," Catherine said, her tone clipped. "She was caught stealing from the estate, jewelry, money, and when confronted she ran off in the middle of the night. It's shameful, really, but perhaps not surprising." James's jaw tightened as disbelief and anger surged within him. "Stealing? Deborah? That's absurd. She would never—" "People aren't always what they seem," Madison interjected, her voice laced with feigned concern. "She manipulated you, James. Tricked you into thinking she was something she's not." Brooklyn nodded, adding, "We tried to help her, to show her the right way to live, but some people just can't be saved." James's hands clenched into fists. "Where is she?" he demanded, his voice rising. "She's not your concern anymore," Catherine replied. "She made her choice. It's better this way, for all of us." The words echoed in the vast hall, but James barely heard them. A cold realization settled over him. Something was deeply wrong. Deborah would never leave without telling him, let alone steal, and the thought of her being alone, pregnant and vulnerable, filled him with dread. A trusted confidant. James wasted no time. He summoned Marcus, the head servant, to his study. The older man entered quietly, his face unreadable, but the moment James closed the door behind them, the tension in the room thickened. "Marcus," James began, his voice steady but firm, "I need the truth. What happened while I was gone?" Marcus hesitated, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. "Sir," he began, his voice low, "it's not my place, but you deserve to know." James stepped closer, his eyes searching Marcus's. "Tell me, please." Marcus exhaled slowly, his expression grim. "Your family forced Mrs. Morrison out. They accused her of theft, spread lies about her character, and isolated her. When her pregnancy became impossible to ignore, they threw her out on a stormy night with nothing but a small bag and the clothes on her back." The words hit James like a physical blow. His chest tightened, his breath catching as the weight of Marcus's confession settled over him. "Pregnancy?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Yes, sir," Marcus said gently. "She was with child, your children. Triplets, as it turns out." James staggered back, his hand gripping the edge of the desk for support. "My children," he murmured, his voice breaking. Marcus nodded. "I found her that night, walking down the road in the storm. She was exhausted and terrified. I took her to my home. She's been there ever since." James's mind raced. Guilt, anger, and desperation churned within him. Why didn't she tell me? Why didn't anyone tell me? "She wanted to," Marcus said, his tone steady. "But your family's lies and cruelty left her with no choice. She's been waiting for you, sir, enduring everything for the sake of those babies." The journey. Without hesitation, James demanded to be taken to her. Marcus guided him through the countryside, the carriage cutting through the quiet night. James's heart pounded with every passing mile, a mix of dread and anticipation tightening his chest. What would he find? Would Deborah forgive him for not being there when she needed him most? When the small cottage came into view, nestled among the trees, James felt his throat tighten. The warm glow of candlelight spilled through the windows, illuminating a scene of quiet peace. It was so unlike the cold, imposing castle he had just left. Marcus dismounted first, opening the door gently. "Mrs. Morrison," he called, his voice soft but clear. "There's someone here to see you." A family reunited. Inside, Deborah sat by the fire, her face serene but tired. She was nursing one of the babies, her body relaxed despite the exhaustion that lingered in her eyes. When she looked up and saw James standing in the doorway, her breath caught. "James," she whispered, her voice trembling. For a moment, neither of them moved. The weight of everything unspoken hung heavy in the air. Then James took a step forward, his knees buckling as he sank to the floor before her. His eyes brimmed with tears as they met hers. "Deborah," he choked out, his voice breaking. I didn't know. I didn't know what they'd done to you. I'm so sorry." Deborah's eyes filled with tears, but she held his gaze. "I thought I'd never see you again," she admitted, her voice trembling. James reached for her free hand, clutching it tightly. "You'll never have to feel that way again," he vowed. "I swear to you, Deborah, I'll never let anything come between us again." His eyes shifted to the crib beside her, where two more tiny forms stirred. His breath caught as he took in the sight of his children, his sons and daughter, each one a perfect, living testament to the love he and Deborah shared. "They're beautiful," he whispered, his voice filled with awe. Carefully, he reached for the baby in Deborah's arms, his hands trembling as he cradled the small, warm bundle. "They've missed you," Deborah said softly. James looked up at her, tears streaming down his face. "I've missed everything," he said, "but I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." As the fire crackled and the night deepened, James held his family close, the pieces of his shattered world slowly coming back together. For the first time in weeks, Deborah felt the weight of her fear lift, replaced by the warmth of the man who had finally come home. Chapter 14. Revenge and Redemption. The morning light crept over the horizon, casting its golden glow on Marcus and Emma's humble cottage. Inside, James stood before the hearth, his jaw set and his eyes blazing with determination. He had spent the night holding his family, whispering apologies and promises to Deborah and his 3 perfect children, but now, as the sun rose, so did his fury. The Morrison Castle had long stood as a symbol of power and legacy, but James knew its foundations were rotten. It was time to confront the betrayal that had nearly cost him everything. "We're going back," James said firmly, turning to Deborah, who sat with the babies nestled in her lap. Deborah's brow furrowed. "Back? James? What good will it do? They've already shown who they are." James knelt before her, his hand covering hers. "Because it's not just about us anymore. It's about the future. Our children deserve better than to live in the shadow of their hatred. And you," his voice softened, "you deserve justice." The return to the castle. The carriage ride to the castle was somber, the weight of the task ahead pressing heavily on James's shoulders. Marcus sat beside him, a stack of documents in his lap. Letters, receipts, and sworn statements he had collected to expose the lies Catherine, Madison, and Brooklyn had spun. When they arrived, the castle loomed as it always had, its grandeur untouched by the storm of emotions brewing inside James. He carried Deborah's image in his mind, the strength in her eyes, and the quiet grace she had maintained despite the cruelty she had faced. That strength fueled his resolve. The family gathered in the grand hall, summoned by James's abrupt return. Catherine stood at the center, her posture rigid and her expression unreadable. Madison and Brooklyn flanked her, their faces pale with unease. "James," Catherine began, her voice smooth but cautious, "what is the meaning of this? You should be settling back into your responsibilities." James stepped forward, his gaze icy. "Responsibilities? You mean the ones you undermined when you threw my pregnant wife out into the storm?" Catherine's mask of composure faltered, but she recovered quickly. "James, don't be ridiculous. Deborah, don't you dare speak her name!" James roared, his voice echoing through the hall. His fury was palpable, each word sharp as a blade. "I know everything. Marcus told me what you did, the lies you spread, the cruelty you inflicted, the way you endangered my wife and my children." Madison's eyes widened. "Children," she whispered, glancing nervously at Catherine. "Yes," James said, his voice breaking slightly as he took a step closer. "Triplets, my children. And you—" His gaze shifted to each of them in turn. "You nearly cost them their lives." Brooklyn's voice wavered as she tried to defend herself. We only did what we thought was best for you." James let out a bitter laugh. "Best for me? You think betrayal and cruelty are what's best for me? You were willing to destroy everything I hold dear to protect your twisted sense of pride and superiority." He turned to Marcus, who handed him the stack of documents. James threw them onto the grand table. "These are the truths you tried to bury, the evidence of your treachery, and now you'll face the consequences." The banishment. One by one, James stripped them of their positions within the estate. Catherine's icy composure cracked as he informed her that she would no longer control the family finances. Madison and Brooklyn, who had grown accustomed to their privileged lives, were ordered to leave the estate entirely. "You can take what fits in a single trunk," James said coldly. "Everything else stays here. The estate you cherish so dearly will no longer be yours to wield as a weapon." "You can't do this!" Catherine cried, her voice trembling with anger and fear. "I built this family. I protected its legacy." "No," James replied, his tone resolute. "You built walls of hatred and division. You used this castle to control and demean. That ends now." Deborah's mercy. The confrontation was brutal, and James's fury was unrelenting. But as Catherine, Madison, and Brooklyn stood in stunned silence, Deborah's voice rang out softly from the doorway. "James," she said, her tone calm but firm, Enough. He turned to see her standing there, her presence a beacon of grace amidst the chaos. In her arms, she held one of their sons, his tiny hand clutching her shawl. "They're still your family," Deborah said, her eyes meeting his. "Let them learn from this, but don't let anger consume you." James's jaw tightened, but he nodded. Deborah stepped forward, her voice steady as she addressed Catherine and the others. "You hurt me in ways I'll never forget," she said, "but hate doesn't heal. You've lost everything you thought mattered, but maybe that's what you needed to see the truth. Use this time to reflect, to change." Catherine's lip quivered, and for the first time the matriarch of the Morrison family looked vulnerable. "Deborah," she began, her voice barely audible. "Don't apologize," Deborah interrupted gently. "Not to me. Prove your regret through your actions." A month of change. The Morrison women left the castle that evening, their trunks packed and their heads bowed. They moved to a modest cottage on the outskirts of Hill Country Village, where they experienced poverty and discrimination for the first time in their lives. The sting of being on the other side of the social divide was a harsh lesson, but it forced them to confront their own prejudices. Over time, small gestures began to emerge. Catherine helping at the local church, Madison volunteering at a school, Brooklyn offering aid to struggling families. Each act was a step toward redemption, a quiet acknowledgement of the pain they had caused. The castle reborn. Back at the castle, James and Deborah worked tirelessly to transform the estate into a symbol of unity and compassion. They opened its doors to the community, hosting events that brought people together regardless of race or status. The once intimidating walls became a sanctuary filled with laughter, love, and the pitter-patter of their children's feet. Their love story became the heart of Hill Country Village, a reminder that change was possible and that love could conquer even the deepest divides. Years later, as James and Deborah stood on the castle's balcony, watching their children play in the garden below, James wrapped his arm around her and said softly, "You saved me, Deborah. You saved all of us." Deborah smiled, her heart full. "No," she replied. "We saved each other." Their tale echoed through generations, a testament to the power of forgiveness, the strength of love, and the unyielding hope that even the coldest hearts could be transformed. A lesson in resilience, encouragement, and great motivation from Deborah's story. Deborah's story is not just a tale of endurance, it's a masterclass in self-respect, healing, and transformation. For anyone who has faced betrayal, heartbreak, or the collapse of what was once a dream, her journey offers powerful lessons and boundless encouragement. It's a reminder that no matter how shattered you may feel, you have the strength to rebuild a life filled with love, dignity, and purpose. 1. Your pain is not permanent. Deborah's journey began in a storm, both literal and emotional. Betrayed by those who should have been family, she was cast out at her most vulnerable. Yet even in her darkest moment, she moved forward, driven by the promise of a brighter future for herself and her unborn children. Encouragement. Whatever storm you are facing now, know that it is temporary. Pain, no matter how deep, will eventually give way to healing. Hold on to hope, even if it feels faint, and keep moving forward. 2. You are stronger than you think. Deborah didn't crumble under the weight of betrayal. She tapped into a strength she didn't know she had, finding the courage to survive, endure, and protect her children. Her story reminds us that even when life feels unbearable, we possess untapped reservoirs of resilience. Motivation. You are far more capable than you realize. Life may test you, but these challenges are opportunities to discover just how strong you are. Trust in your ability to overcome. 3. Let compassion be your guiding light. When Marcus and Emma extended their kindness to Deborah, they showed her that love and humanity still existed in the world. Their support gave her the foundation she needed to heal and thrive. Lesson: be open to receiving help and kindness from others. Surround yourself with those who lift you up, and don't be afraid to lean on them. Equally, let your own compassion guide you as you rebuild your life. 4. Redemption comes through forgiveness, not hatred. Deborah had every reason to hold on to anger and resentment toward James's family, but when the moment came, she chose forgiveness. Her mercy wasn't weakness. It was an act of courage that allowed her to break free from bitterness and focus on a brighter future. Encouragement. Forgiveness isn't about excusing the wrongs done to you. It's about freeing yourself from the weight of anger and finding peace. Letting go doesn't mean forgetting. It means reclaiming your power and choosing joy. 5. Your self-worth is non-negotiable. Even when cast out, Deborah never let her mistreatment define her. She clung to the truth of her own value, knowing that her worth was not dictated by the opinions of others. Motivation. No betrayal or heartbreak can take away your intrinsic worth. You are deserving of love, respect, and happiness, no matter what others may try to make you believe. 6. Every ending is a beginning. What seemed like the end for Deborah, a life of luxury and security, was actually the beginning of a life rooted in authenticity, love, and unity. Her fall from the castle led her to find true family, raise her children with love, and inspire an entire community. Encouragement. When one chapter closes, it's not the end of your story. Life has a way of leading us to places we never imagined, often far better than what we left behind. Embrace new beginnings, even if they come disguised as endings. 7. Love. Real love is healing. James's return wasn't what saved Deborah. She had already saved herself. But his unwavering love and determination to make things right became a powerful testament to the transformative power of genuine love. Motivation, true love, whether it's romantic, familial, or self-love, doesn't tear you down. It builds you up. Seek relationships that nurture and honor your worth, and never settle for anything less. 8. You can be an inspiration. Deborah's strength and forgiveness didn't just heal her family, they inspired an entire community. Her story became a beacon of hope, showing that even the deepest wounds could lead to the most profound transformations. Encouragement. Your story, no matter how painful or challenging, has the power to inspire others. By rising from your struggles, you show the world that resilience and love can overcome even the harshest of trials. Final reflection. Turning pain into power. Deborah's journey from betrayal to redemption reminds us that we are never defined by the worst moments of our lives. Pain is a teacher, resilience is a gift, and every step forward is a victory. If you've been betrayed, cheated, or hurt, know that your story doesn't end here. Like Deborah, you have the strength to rise, the courage to forgive, and the power to create a future filled with love and hope. You are not alone. You are not broken. You are capable of more than you can imagine. Keep moving forward. Your best days are still ahead.